Welcome, everyone. I know many of you are here to relax and fall asleep. So let's start by getting comfortable. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the tension from the day slip away. Whether you're listening from your bed or a cozy corner, I'm here to guide you into a world of gentle chills and eerie tales to help you drift off. Before we begin, feel free to comment where you're tuning in from. I'd love to know. Now, just relax, let your mind wander, and let's get started with tonight's story. Chapter 1, 6 hours into my 8-hour shift, and the ache in my lower back had become a constant companion. Just another Thursday night at Sterling and Associates, pushing my cleaning cart through endless corridors of corporate monotony. The vacuum's drone had long since become white noise, punctuated only by the occasional squeak of my cart's wheels against the polished floor. 10:47 p.m. Almost done. Tomorrow was my night off, and the thought of sleeping had made the remaining tasks more bearable. The 15th floor was always the last on my route. Mostly executive offices with their pretentious mahogany desks and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. At this hour, the building was a ghost town, save for the occasional workaholic burning the midnight oil on the lower floors. I just finished Mr. Sterling's corner office when I noticed it. The motion sensor lights in room 1502, which I cleaned 20 minutes ago, flickered to life. Must be faulty wiring, I thought, making a mental note to report it to maintenance. But as I watched, the lights in 1503 blinked on too, then off, like someone had walked through and vanished. My throat tightened. I'd been working here for 3 years, and the building's nighttime sounds were as familiar to me as my own breathing. But something felt different tonight. The air seemed thicker, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "Hello." My voice sounded small in the vast emptiness. No response, just the soft hum of the ventilation system. I turned back to my cart, reaching for the glass cleaner, when I froze. The bottle wasn't where I'd left it. In fact, several of my supplies had shifted positions ever so slightly, as if someone had examined them and placed them back carelessly. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I might have imagined it, floating down the hallway like cigarette smoke. Finally, "Who's there?" I called out, my voice stronger this time, angry even. If this was some junior executive's idea of a joke, I wasn't laughing. "Found you." The whispers multiplied, becoming a chorus of unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, heart thundering in my chest, and caught movement in the window's reflection, a dark figure, tall and unnaturally thin, standing directly behind me. I whirled around. Nothing, just empty space and fluorescent lights. My hands trembled as I gripped the cart's handle. Get it together? I told myself. You're tired, working too many doubles lately. The mind plays tricks when you're exhausted. But as I pushed my cart toward the elevator, I saw them. In every window, every glass partition, every reflective surface, shadows moving independently of any source. They twisted and writhed like smoke, taking vaguely human shapes before dissolving again. And they were getting closer. "This isn't real," I muttered, abandoning my cart and walking faster. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The elevators were 30 feet ahead. 20. 10. I jabbed the down button repeatedly, glancing over my shoulder. The shadows in the windows had become more distinct. Dozens of them now, all with hollow eyes fixed on me. The elevator dinged, and I nearly sobbed with relief. But as the doors began to open, they suddenly slammed shut with such force the entire wall shuddered. I ran to the emergency stairs, yanking on the handle. Locked. Impossible. These doors were never locked. The whispers had become extremely distant. Somehow they conscious play with us. I sprinted down the hallway. No destination beyond the crystal light. Every door I passed slammed shut. An orchestrated symphony of light under the silent mountain. The lights began to flicker, then swirled in darkness. I saw broken and blanket. I bolted to the lobby and burst out into screaming. My car started raining far toward the parking lot, and I ran to it like a drowning man from the lake. The gentleman drive. Hold myself. Get far away and never come back. But as I reached for the door handle, I caught my reflection in the window. I wasn't reaching for anything. My reflection stood perfectly still, staring back at me with an impossibly wide grin that split its face like a wound. As I watched, paralyzed with horror, it pressed its hands against the glass from the inside and whispered, "Thank you for letting us out." Behind me, I heard the building's doors open, followed by the sound of countless footsteps. They moved almost lazily now. After all, they had all the time in the world. And as the shadows crept closer, my reflection's grin grew wider and wider and wider. In the morning, they found my cleaning cart abandoned on the 15th floor. The security footage showed me entering the building at the start of my shift, but never leaving. The police filed a missing persons report, but eventually, the case went cold. Just another unsolved disappearance in a big city. But if you ever work late at Sterling and Associates, you might catch a glimpse of something in the windows, a familiar face pushing a ghostly cleaning cart, forever working the last shift. And if you look closely, you'll notice something strange about the reflection. It's smiling. That's how I ended up here, trapped in this liminal space between reality and reflection. I see the new janitor sometimes, making his rounds just like I used to. I want to warn him, to tell him to run before they find him too. But all I can do is smile, smile, smile as the shadows gather around me, whispering their plans for the next shift worker who stays too late, who looks too long at their reflection, who finally sets them free. Chapter 2 echoes in the woods. The crunch of dead leaves beneath my hiking boots should have been comforting. It wasn't. 5 miles into Blackwood Trail. And each step felt like an attempt to distance myself, not just from civilization, but from the wreckage of my 3-year relationship with Michael. His words still echoed in my head. "I just don't feel the same anymore, Sarah." The late October air bit at my cheeks as I pushed deeper into the forest. I'd hiked this trail dozens of times before. It was my sanctuary, my escape route whenever life became too overwhelming. Today, though, something felt different. The familiar path held an edge I couldn't quite identify, like a painting tilted slightly off-center. The first sign something was wrong came when I passed the old oak tree that marked the halfway point of my usual route. A branch snapped somewhere behind me, not the gentle crack of wood giving way to wind, but a sharp, deliberate sound. I spun around, my heart skipping a beat, but saw only the endless rows of trees stretching into shadow. "Hello!" My voice sounded foreign in the stillness. That's when I noticed it, the silence. No bird song, no rustling leaves, no chattering squirrels. The forest had gone completely, unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. I checked my phone, 3:47 p.m. Plenty of daylight left, but the sky had taken on a strange, muted quality, like sunshine filtering through dirty glass. The air felt heavier too, charged with an electricity that made my skin prickle. Another snap, closer this time. Then another. Something was moving through the undergrowth, matching my pace. I quickened my steps, no longer interested in clearing my mind or finding peace. All I wanted now was to get back to my car, but the path back seemed wrong. I'd walked this trail so many times I could practically do it blindfolded, yet nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees pressed in closer, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers across the trail. Had it always been this dense, this dark? A laugh floated through the trees, soft, melodic, achingly familiar. My laugh. I froze, blood turning to ice in my veins. 20 yards ahead, partially obscured by a thick trunk, stood a figure, female my height, wearing the same blue hiking jacket and black leggings I had on. As I watched, paralyzed, it stepped into full view. It was me, but wrong. The proportions were slightly off, like a reflection in warped glass. Its limbs were too long, joints bending at impossible angles. And its face, God, its face. My features were there, but arranged in a way that made my stomach lurch. The eyes were too large, too far apart, and its smile stretched literally from ear to ear, filled with teeth that looked filed to points. The thing that wore my face raised one distorted hand and beckoned, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Sarah. It called in my voice, but layered with something else, something ancient and hungry. Come walk with me. We have so much to talk about. I ran. I sprinted back the way I'd come, or at least I thought I had. But nothing made sense anymore. The trees seemed to move, rearranging themselves with every step I took. Branches whipped at my face. Roots reached up to snag my feet. The very forest seemed alive and malevolent, conspiring with my pursuer. You can't run from yourself, Sarah. The voice came from everywhere now, echoing between the trees. We both know that. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, faster. The rational part of my brain had shut down completely, leaving only blind animal panic. But no matter which direction I turned, the path ahead grew darker, denser, more twisted. The trees pressed closer, their bark now resembling faces frozen in silent screams. I've been so lonely. My voice called out from behind me. We've been so lonely, ever since Michael left. But we don't need him anymore. We'll have each other. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. It moved like a spider, my doppelganger, limbs bending and twisting as it skittered between the trees with impossible speed. Its head was cocked at an angle that would have snapped a normal neck. That terrible smile still stretched across its face. My foot caught a root, and I went down hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. I scrambled to my feet, but my ankle gave way beneath me. Through tears of pain and terror, I saw the forest had changed completely. The trees had grown so close together their trunks merged, forming a solid wall of writhing wood. There was nowhere left to run. Poor Sarah, it whispered. So close now I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. Always running. From Michael. From yourself. But I'm here now. I'll never leave you. I collapsed, my body betraying me as exhaustion and fear won out. The forest floor was soft, almost welcoming. As consciousness began to fade, I felt long, cold fingers brush my hair. Sleep now. My voice soothed. When you wake up, we'll be together. Forever. The search party found my car 3 days later, parked at the Blackwood Trailhead. They combed the forest for weeks, but found no trace of me. The official report suggested I got lost, succumbed to exposure, or fell into one of the many ravines that dotted the area. They were wrong. I'm still here, in the woods. Sometimes I catch glimpses of hikers on the trail, and I want to warn them, to tell them to run before it finds them too. But all I can do is watch from between the trees, my smile stretching wider and wider as they pass by, unaware of what waits in the shadows. And sometimes, on quiet days when the birds fall silent, I hear my own laughter echoing through the trees. But I can't tell anymore if it's coming from me, or from her, or if there's even a difference anymore. They say you can't run from your demons, but they never tell you what happens when your demons catch up, when they wear your face and speak with your voice, when they promise to make you whole again, even as they tear you apart. I know now. I know all too well. If you ever find yourself on Blackwood Trail, and the forest goes quiet, and you hear familiar laughter dancing between the trees, run as fast and as far as you can. But know this, no matter how far you go, you can't escape yourself. We're all still here, all the lost ones, watching from between the trees, waiting, smiling, and sometimes, if you look closely, you might catch a glimpse of us. Faces in the bark, shadows that move against the wind, fragments of ourselves scattered through the endless woods. But by then, it's already too late, because the thing about echoes is they never really fade. They just keep bouncing back, distorted and wrong, until you can't remember which voice was yours to begin with. And in these woods, every echo finds its way home eventually, even yours. Chapter 3, Room 413, the fluorescent lights of the Gateway Hotel lobby buzzed like angry wasps as I dragged my wheeled suitcase across the faded carpet. 14 hours of flights, 2 delayed connections, and a sales pitch that had gone nowhere. I was running on fumes and coffee that had long since turned bitter in my stomach. Checking in, I mumbled to the night clerk, sliding my corporate card across the counter. Reservation for James Mitchell. The clerk's fingers moved across his keyboard with mechanical precision. His name tag read Edwin, though something about the way it sat on his chest seemed wrong, as if it had been pinned to a mannequin rather than a person. Ah, yes, Mr. Mitchell. Room 413. Would you like a wake-up call? No, thanks. I just wanted to collapse into bed and forget this day ever happened. The elevator arrived with a sound that wasn't quite a ding, more like the whimper of a wounded animal. As I stepped inside, the doors closed with a grinding screech that set my teeth on edge. The cable mechanisms above groaned as the car began its ascent, each floor marked by a shudder that seemed to travel up through my bones. When the doors finally opened on the 4th floor, I could have sworn they whispered. The hallway stretched out before me, illuminated by wall sconces that cast more shadows than light. My room was about halfway down, and as I approached, I noticed the brass numbers on the door flickering, as if caught in a strobe light. 413, 314, 413, 314, until I blinked and they settled back into place. Just exhaustion playing tricks on my eyes, I told myself, nothing more. The key card worked on the 3rd try, and I stumbled into a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and something else. Something sweeter, almost floral, but with an undertone of decay. Like lilies at a funeral. I didn't bother unpacking. Just kicked off my shoes, stripped down to my underwear, and fell into bed. The sheets were cool against my skin, though they carried that same strange scent. As consciousness began to fade, I thought I heard something that might have been footsteps in the hall, might have been whispers behind the walls. I woke sometime later to darkness and disorientation. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m., its red numbers the only source of light in the room. Something had pulled me from sleep, a sound maybe, or... The door was open, just a crack, but I distinctly remembered closing and latching it. I got up, my bare feet silent on the carpet, and pushed it shut. The lock engaged with a solid click. Back in bed, I pulled the covers up to my chin, feeling foolish for being unsettled by something so trivial. But as I lay there, trying to will myself back to sleep, I heard it, a soft scraping sound, followed by the unmistakable creak of hinges. The door was open again. My heart began to pound as I watched the sliver of darkness in the doorway slowly widen. The hall light should have spilled in, but there was only blackness beyond the threshold, as if the corridor had been swallowed by void. I reached for the bedside lamp. It clicked, but no light came. The clock now read 3:33 a.m., its red glow seeming to pulse like a dying heart. That's when I saw it, a figure sitting at the foot of my bed. It was shaped like a person, but wrong, somehow. Too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly distorted in ways that made my mind recoil. It sat perfectly still, facing away from me, its head cocked at an impossible angle. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only watch as, with horrible slowness, it began to turn. Its neck rotated first, twisting far beyond what human anatomy should allow. Then its torso, bones cracking like wet timber. Finally, its lower body shifted, until it faced me completely. Where its face should have been was only smooth, pale flesh, interrupted by a single vertical line, a seam, I realized with rising horror, that began to split open like a wound, revealing rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth. I bolted, threw myself out of bed and through the door, not caring that I was nearly naked, caring only about escape. But the hallway had changed. It stretched before me impossibly endlessly, the walls rippling like heat waves over summer asphalt. The sconces flickered madly, and in their strobing light, I saw other doors. Hundreds of them, thousands, all marked 413. I ran anyway, ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, but the corridor never ended. Behind me, I heard something moving, a dry sliding sound, like scales over carpet, accompanied by that terrible cracking of reorganizing bones. When I could run no more, I ducked into the nearest room. Room 413. My room, exactly as I'd left it, down to my rumpled sheets and discarded clothes. I slammed the door through the lock and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Then I huddled in the corner, watching as the minutes on the clock ticked by with excruciating slowness. 4:13 a.m. A knock at the door. Room service, Mr. Mitchell. My voice. It was my voice. I didn't order anything. I called back, though my throat was so dry the words came out as barely a whisper. "Oh, but you did." My voice replied, cheerful and wrong. "Everyone does, eventually. Won't you let me in? The food's getting cold." Another knock, harder this time. The chair legs scraped against the carpet. "Please, Mr. Mitchell. You don't want to be rude, do you? Not in room 413. Not when you've already been such a perfect guest." The knocking became pounding, became a rhythmic thudding that shook the walls. The chair started to splinter. "Last chance, Mr. Mitchell. Though I suppose it doesn't really matter. Time works differently here, you see. We have all night, every night, forever." The door burst open. They found my suitcase the next morning, still sitting by the bed in room 413. My clothes were laid out neatly. My laptop powered down. My phone showing several missed calls from the office. The bed was made, with crisp hospital corners and freshly fluffed pillows. Everything in perfect order. The official report suggested I checked out early, though no one remembered seeing me leave. They noted that the room's electronic lock showed no activity after my initial entry, and security cameras captured nothing unusual in the hallways that night. But if you ever stay at the Gateway Hotel and find yourself assigned to room 413, you might notice something odd about the room service menu sitting on the desk. Among the usual offerings, club sandwiches, Caesar salads, overpriced bottles of wine, there's an item listed at the very bottom, printed in type so small you have to squint to read it. Special of the night. Your darkest dreams served raw. Price, everything you are. And if you listen carefully in those dark hours before dawn, you might hear footsteps in the hallway, might catch the sound of someone whistling a cheerful tune. But whatever you do, don't open the door. I did. And now I'm here, in this endless corridor of identical rooms, knocking on doors and calling out in voices that aren't quite mine anymore, waiting for the next guest who's tired enough, lonely enough, desperate enough to answer. After all, everyone orders room service eventually, and in room 413, we're always happy to serve. Chapter for the babysitter's shift the Henderson's house looked exactly like every other home on Maple Street. Red brick, white trim, perfectly manicured lawn. Nothing about it suggested that this Saturday night would be anything but routine. Just another babysitting gig to help pay for my textbooks. "Emergency numbers are on the fridge," Mrs. Henderson said, adjusting her earrings. "The kids have already had dinner, so just make sure they're in bed by 8:30. We should be back around midnight." I nodded, going through my mental checklist. Any special bedtime routines I should know about? "Oh, Emma and Tyler are pretty good about that," Mr. Henderson replied, helping his wife with her coat. "They know the drill, though they might try to convince you otherwise." He winked. As their car pulled out of the driveway, I turned to find two pairs of eyes studying me intently. Emma, age 8, had her mother's golden curls and her father's skeptical expression. 6-year-old Tyler clutched a worn stuffed dinosaur, regarding me with solemn curiosity. "So," I said, summoning my best Mary Poppins impression, "what shall we do first?" The next 2 hours passed pleasantly enough. We built a blanket fort in the living room, played 3 rounds of Candyland, and I only had to referee one minor squabble over the TV remote. Pretty standard stuff for a babysitting job. Then Emma said something that made my blood run cold. "There's someone watching us again." She said it so casually, not even looking up from her coloring book. Tyler nodded, adding another crayon to their collective pile. "What do you mean, again?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The person in the window," Tyler explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "They come most nights. Mommy and Daddy can't see them, but we can." I forced a laugh. "Must be your imagination playing tricks on you." Emma shook her head. "No, look, they're there now." I followed her pointing finger to the bay window overlooking the backyard. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a pale oval that might have been a face, but when I blinked, there was only darkness beyond the glass. "Time for bed," I announced, perhaps a bit too firmly. The kids protested, but I stayed firm. Within 30 minutes, they were tucked in, night lights glowing softly in their rooms. I settled onto the living room couch with my psychology textbook, determined to get some studying done. The house creaked and settled around me, normal sounds that suddenly seemed more noticeable in the quiet. That's when I heard it, a distinct thump from upstairs. I froze, straining to listen. Maybe one of the kids had gotten up for water? But no! There it was again, and definitely not from their rooms. It was coming from above them, the attic. My phone showed 10:17 p.m. The Hendersons wouldn't be back for almost 2 hours. I debated calling them, but what would I say? "Hey, sorry to interrupt your date night, but your house is making scary noises." Another thump, followed by what sounded like scratching, like something dragging its nails across the ceiling. I had to check. What if it was a raccoon or something? The last thing I needed was some animal breaking through and terrorizing the kids. The attic access was at the end of the upstairs hallway, a pull-down ladder that descended with a whisper of wood against wood. The beam from my phone's flashlight revealed stacks of boxes, old furniture draped in sheets, all the usual attic inhabitants. And something else. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a dusty dresser, was a door. Not the kind of door you'd expect to find in an attic. This was heavy, made of dark wood, with intricate carvings around its frame. It looked ancient, completely out of place in this modern suburban home. As I approached, the scratching sound grew louder. Something was definitely on the other side of that door. "Hello," I called out weakly, immediately regretting it. The scratching stopped. Then came a voice, high and thin, like wind through dead leaves. Finally, someone heard us. I stumbled backward as the door began to move, not opening, bulging, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. The wood groaned in protest as the hinges slowly gave way. A pale, skeletal hand emerged through the widening gap, its fingers impossibly long and jointed in all the wrong places. It scrabbled at the floorboards, pulling, and behind it came an arm, equally wrong, bent at angles that made my mind recoil. Then I saw its face. God, its face. Chalk white skin stretched too tight over hollow cheeks. Black holes where eyes should be. And its mouth. A lipless gash that split open to reveal row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. "We've been so lonely," it whispered, its voice now a chorus of many. "The children see us, but they're too young, too innocent. But you're perfect." I ran, fled down the ladder, so fast I nearly fell, slamming the attic access behind me. I could hear it moving above, its body making wet sliding sounds across the floor. The kids. I had to get the kids. I burst into Emma's room first, then Tyler's, scooping them both up despite their sleepy protests. We were halfway down the stairs when I heard the attic ladder descending. "Don't leave," the voices called. "We have so much to show you." We made it outside just as something pale, and twisted emerged from the upstairs hallway. I buckled the kids into my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the seatbelts. 20 minutes later, the Hendersons found us in the parking lot of a well-lit McDonald's. I tried to explain about the door, the creature, but they just looked confused. Attic, Mr. Henderson said. We don't have an attic. Never have. But Emma and Tyler were nodding, their eyes wide with understanding. The people in the windows, Emma whispered. They live up there, in the door that isn't supposed to be there. I quit babysitting after that night. Changed my major from psychology to accounting. Numbers make sense. Numbers don't hide impossible doors or crawl through windows at night. But sometimes, when I drive past the Henderson house, I see movement in the upstairs windows. And sometimes, if I look quickly enough, I catch a glimpse of pale faces pressed against the glass, their black hole eyes following my car as I pass. The children still live there, though they're older now. I wonder if they still see the things that watch them, still hear the scratching above their beds at night. Part of me wants to warn their new babysitter, but what would I say? Be careful of the attic that doesn't exist, and the door that leads to nowhere, and the things that live behind it. Besides, it's probably too late. They've already been invited in. I know, because I drive past that house every day on my way to work, and lately I've noticed something new, something that makes my blood run cold, and my hands shake on the steering wheel. There's a help wanted sign in the front yard babysitter needed. And sometimes, when the light hits it just right, I swear I can see other words written beneath, in handwriting that looks suspiciously like my own. Come back to us. We're still so lonely. I won't go back. I can't, but someone will. Someone always does. After all, it's just another babysitting job, right? Just another night in a perfectly normal house, with perfectly normal children and a perfectly normal attic that doesn't exist. At least, that's what we tell ourselves. But if you ever find yourself on Maple Street and see a babysitter wanted sign in front of a red brick house with white trim, drive on by. Don't stop. Don't look up at the windows. And whatever you do, don't answer when they call your name, because they will call. They always do. And this time, they might not let you leave. Chapter 5, The Lurker, the rhythmic impact of my running shoes against the pavement usually cleared my head. Usually. Tonight, though, the numbers from the quarterly report kept flashing behind my eyes with each stride. Red ink everywhere. The board meeting tomorrow would be brutal. 10:47 p.m. Later than my normal running time, but after 12 hours at the office, I needed this. Needed to feel something besides the creeping dread of impending professional disaster. The streetlights cast pools of sodium yellow light at regular intervals along Cedar Avenue, creating a strobe effect as I jogged through light and shadow, light and shadow. The night was unusually still. No cars, no other runners. Not even the usual chorus of crickets. Just the sound of my breathing and footfalls echoing off silent houses. That's when I first saw it. The figure stood directly under the streetlight at the corner of Cedar and Oak, perfectly centered in the pool of light. Something about its posture seemed wrong. Too still, too straight. Like a mannequin someone had placed there as a prank. I blinked, and for a moment, thought I saw it turn its head to follow my movement. But that was impossible at this distance. Just my imagination, fueled by too much caffeine and too little sleep. I kept running, completing my usual loop around the block. 8 minutes later, I approached the same corner. The figure was still there, exactly there, same position, same unnatural stillness. Only, was it facing a slightly different direction now? My pace faltered for a moment, but I forced myself to maintain rhythm. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was one of those promotional standees businesses sometimes put out. Or maybe, third route, the figure remained, but something had definitely changed. It stood closer to the street now, no longer centered under the light. And this time, I was certain, its head moved to track me as I passed. I picked up my pace. The smart thing would be to turn around, take a different route home. But that would mean running directly past it, and something deep in my primitive brain screamed against that idea. Fourth loop. My heart nearly stopped. The figure stood in the middle of the road. I skidded to a halt about 50 yards away. From here, I could make out more details, though my mind recoiled from processing them. Its proportions were subtly wrong. Arms too long, neck too thin. It wore what might have been a suit, but the fabric seemed to shift and ripple even though there was no wind. And its face. Where its face should have been was only darkness, deeper than the night around it. A void that seemed to pull at my vision, making my eyes water if I looked too long. Hello. My voice sounded pathetically small in the empty street. It didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, watching me with that faceless face. Until it took a step forward. I ran, sprinted, actually, faster than I'd ever run in my life. Blind panic gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. But with each frenzied glance over my shoulder, I saw it matching my pace exactly. Not running, not even walking, just gliding, its feet hovering slightly above the pavement. The distance between us never changed. 30 yards, always 30 yards no matter how fast I ran, no matter which turns I took. It maintained that precise gap, like a fisherman playing out line, letting the fish tire itself before reeling it in. My lungs were on fire. Spots danced at the edges of my vision. I couldn't maintain this pace much longer. My house was just ahead, 100 yards, 50, 20. I fumbled with my keys as I ran, nearly dropping them twice before managing to grip the right one. 10 yards, 5. I could hear it behind me now, a soft sound, like silk sliding over stone. The key slipped into the lock. I threw myself inside, slammed the door, and engaged every lock with trembling fingers. For a long moment, I stood there in my darkened entryway, gasping for breath, listening. Nothing, no sound except my own ragged breathing and the thunder of blood in my ears. Then, from behind me, came a whisper, soft as dead leaves skittering across pavement. You run well. I turned, slowly, knowing what I would see but unable to stop myself. It stood in my living room, its impossible proportions made even more apparent in the confined space. Its head nearly brushed my 8-foot ceiling, neck craned at an angle that would have snapped human vertebrae. But you can't outrun yourself, it continued, its voice like radio static shaped into words. No one can. What are you? I managed to choke out. You know what I am, they replied. You've always known. I'm the thing that lurks at the edges of your vision, the shadow you convince yourself isn't following you, the footsteps that match your pace in empty hallways. It took a step closer, the darkness where its face should have been seen to deepen, to reach out toward me with tendrils of pure void. I'm the doubt that keeps you awake at night, the fear that wraps around your throat when you're alone, the voice that whispers you're not good enough every time you fail. Another step. The air grew thick, hard to breathe. I've been waiting so long for you to notice me, to really see me, and now that you have. Its arm extended toward me, fingers elongating impossibly, stretching across the space between us like shadows at sunset. Now that you have, we can finally be what we were always meant to be. We. My voice cracked on the word. Of course. After all. It leaned forward, the void of its face inches from mine. I'm already inside you, have been all along. I am your fear, your doubt, your self-loathing. And now that you've let me in, really let me in, we'll never be apart again. Its fingers brushed my cheek, cold as grave dirt, and I felt something inside me shift, like a door opening that could never be closed. They found my body the next morning, slumped over my desk at work. Heart attack, they said. Stress and overwork. Not unusual for someone in finance, especially during quarter end. But that's not what really happened. I'm still here, you see. Still running my loops around Cedar Avenue every night. Still wearing my suit, though the fabric moves strangely now. Still watching joggers pass under streetlights, counting the seconds until they notice me, because that's how it spreads. That's how it grows. One person at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, until we're all just shadows watching shadows, lurking at the edges of reality. So the next time you're out for a late-night run and you see something standing under a streetlight, something too still, too straight, too wrong, don't look too closely. Don't let yourself really see it. Because once you do, once you truly understand what you're looking at, well, there's always room for one more lurker in the shadows. Always room for one more voice in the chorus of watchers. Always room for one more face in the void. And we're so eager to show you your place among us. Just look up. Look closer. We're waiting. Chapter 6, The Mirrors, gazed the real estate agent hadn't mentioned why the rent was so reasonable for a downtown apartment. I didn't ask. After my messy breakup with David, I was just grateful to find a place I could afford on my editorial assistant salary. A fresh start. That's what I told myself as I signed the lease. The previous tenant had left behind a few pieces of furniture, including an ornate full-length mirror mounted on the bathroom wall. Its bronze frame was intricate, decorated with what looked like intertwined vines and flowers. A little old-fashioned for my taste, but it added character to the otherwise bland space. I spent that first day unpacking, arranging and rearranging my meager possessions until the apartment began to feel like home. It wasn't until evening, when I went to wash my face before bed, that I noticed something odd about the mirror. Just for a moment, a fraction of a second, I could have sworn my reflection moved after I'd stopped moving. Like an echo in glass, a slight delay between action and image. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes. Exhaustion, obviously. The stress of moving, of starting over. But it happened again the next morning. As I brushed my teeth, my reflection's hand seemed to continue the motion after I paused. When I leaned in to apply mascara, the mirror me took a heartbeat too long to match my movement. I started avoiding the bathroom mirror when possible, using my small makeup compact instead. But sometimes, catching glimpses from the corner of my eye, I'd see my reflection doing things I wasn't, turning its head slightly, shifting its weight, watching me with an intentness I never wore on my own face. You're being ridiculous, I told myself firmly about a week after moving in. It's just a mirror. I forced myself to stand directly in front of it, hands gripping the sink's edge. My reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. I raised my right hand. It raised its left, as mirrors do. I touched my nose. It touched its nose. See, normal. Just an ordinary mirror with ordinary physics. Then my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. I knew I wasn't smiling because I could feel my face, frozen in an expression of horror. But my reflection's lips curled upward, spreading into a grin that grew wider and wider until it seemed to split its face in half. I stumbled backward, trying to scream, but producing only a strangled whimper. My reflection didn't move with me. It stood there, still grinning, its head tilting at an impossible angle. "Hello, Rachel," it mouthed, though no sound came out. "I've been waiting so long to meet you properly." I grabbed my hairdryer from the counter and hurled it at the mirror with all my strength. The glass shattered with a sound like breaking ice, fragments cascading into the sink and onto the floor. But the reflection remained. In each shard, no matter how small, I saw that same terrible smile, those same eyes now filled with rage. Dozens of fractured versions of my face glared up at me from the tiles, their mouths moving in silent fury. I ran, fled the bathroom, the apartment, the building, not stopping until I was several blocks away. My bare feet were bleeding. I'd run to the glass without even feeling it. Dawn was just breaking, the city coming alive around me. Normal people heading to normal jobs. Living normal lives where mirrors behaved the way they were supposed to. I caught a glimpse of myself in a storefront window, and nearly screamed. My reflection wasn't running past. It was standing still, watching me, that same twisted smile on its face. I whirled to look at the next window and the next. In every reflective surface, shop windows, car mirrors, even the screen of someone's phone as they passed, I saw it, waiting, watching, smiling. That was 3 days ago. I haven't gone back to the apartment, haven't slept, can't sleep, because every time I close my eyes, I see that smile, feel those eyes on me. I'm in a hotel now, with all the mirrors removed or covered, but it doesn't matter. It's found other ways to reach me. The blank TV screen, the window at night, the chrome coffee pot at the continental breakfast. Always smiling, always watching. Last night, I woke to find my phone screen reflecting the dark room back at me. But the reflection wasn't dark. In it, I could see myself sleeping, except it wasn't me, not really. The thing that wore my face was sitting up in the reflected bed, staring directly into the camera, grinning that horrible grin. Did you think you could hide from me? My own voice whispered from the phone speakers. I'm part of you now. The part you try pretend isn't there. The part you don't want to see. I threw the phone against the wall, but I can still hear its words echoing in my head. Because it was right. Every reflective surface shows me what I've been trying not to see. The darkness inside me. The person I could become. The monster wearing my skin, waiting for its chance to step through the glass. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection unexpectedly, in a puddle, a window, a stranger's sunglasses, I see it reaching for me. Its fingers press against the other side of whatever reflective surface holds it, leaving impressions like hands pressed against fog. The barrier between us is growing thinner. Soon, I think, it will break through entirely, and then we'll truly be face to face. I'm writing this as a warning. If you move into apartment 5B at 1247 Willow Street, don't look too closely at the mirror in the bathroom. Don't trust what you see in its depths. And if your reflection smiles when you're not smiling, run as fast and as far as you can. But know this, no matter where you go, no matter how far you run, you'll never escape it completely. Because it's not just in that mirror anymore. It's in every reflection, every glimpse of yourself you catch unawares. Waiting, watching, smiling that horrible smile. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake in my mirrorless hotel room, staring at the ceiling until my eyes burn, I'm starting to smile back. It happens without my conscious control. My lips curling upward when I catch sight of my reflection, my head tilting at that same impossible angle. Sometimes I find myself standing in front of reflective surfaces without remembering how I got there, pressing my palms against the cold glass as if reaching for something on the other side. Yesterday, a woman on the street hurried away from me, clutching her child's hand. "Mommy," I heard the little girl whisper. Why was that lady smiling like that? I didn't realize I was smiling at all. The hotel manager slipped a note under my door this morning. Complaints from other guests about disturbing behavior. Apparently, they've seen me standing in the hallway at night, staring at the emergency exit signs, grinning at my dim reflection in the polished metal. I don't remember doing this, but I must have, because when I picked up the note, I caught a glimpse of myself in the peephole's reverse image. For just a moment, I saw what they saw. My face split by that terrible smile, my neck bent at an unnatural angle with my eyes. My eyes. They weren't my eyes anymore. I have to go now. Checkout is at 11, and I've stayed too long already. But before I leave, I need to do one thing. Need to look, really look, in a mirror. Need to see what I'm becoming. Because I can feel it inside me, growing stronger every day. The part of me that wants to smile that smile, that wants to tilt my head just so, that wants to press against the glass until it finally breaks. And maybe, when it does, when the barrier between reflection and reality shatters completely, maybe I'll finally be whole again. So if you see me on the street, Don't look too closely. Don't meet my eyes in shop windows or car mirrors. And whatever you do, don't smile back, because that's how it spreads. That's how it grows. One reflection at a time, one smile at a time, until we're all just images pretending to be real, waiting for our chance to step through the glass. Always watching, always smiling, and always waiting for you to smile back. Chapter 7 o'clock had just struck 9 when I finally allowed myself to collapse into my favorite leather armchair. The fabric was worn in all the right places, molded to my shape after countless evenings spent here, seeking refuge from the world. Today had been particularly brutal. 12 hours of mind-numbing meetings, passive-aggressive emails, and a project deadline that seemed to be rushing toward me like an oncoming train. I let out a long breath, watching as tendrils of steam rose from my chamomile tea, dancing in the warm glow of my reading lamp. The rain outside provided a gentle percussion against my second-floor window, its steady rhythm already beginning to wash away the day's tension. I picked up my dog-eared copy of Return to School. Perhaps not the wisest choice for a stormy night alone, but I'd always found comfort in ghost stories. There was something reassuring about supernatural horror when real-world anxieties became too much to bear. The streetlights below cast elongated shadows across my hardwood floors, their amber glow diffused by the rain-streaked glass. I'd always loved this view of my quiet suburban street. The way the wet asphalt reflected light like a dark mirror. It was peaceful, predictable, until I saw it. At first, it was just a dark smudge in my peripheral vision, something that didn't quite fit in the familiar landscape. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting back to that spot beneath the streetlight across the street. That's when I realized what had caught my attention. A figure, standing perfectly still in the rain. I assumed it was one of my neighbors waiting for an Uber, or perhaps someone seeking shelter from the weather, though they made no effort to stay dry under the nearby store awning. I checked my phone, 9:17 p.m. I turned a page in my book, but the words blurred together as my attention repeatedly drew back to the stranger. 9:25 p.m. They hadn't moved, not even slightly. No checking of phones, no shifting of weight, no turning away from the steady drizzle. Just standing. The stillness was unnatural, like a photograph come to life, or perhaps more accurately, like life frozen into a photograph. I set my book down, no longer pretending to read. The figure wore what appeared to be a long, dark coat, though in the rain-distorted light. Its edges seemed to ripple and shift like smoke in the wind. Their face was hidden in the shadow of what might have been a hood, but something about the angle of their posture made my skin prickle with unease. 9:34 p.m. My tea had grown cold, untouched. I realized I'd been holding my breath, though I couldn't say for how long. The figure remained motionless, but something had changed. Something subtle that took my brain a moment to process. Their head was tilted up at my window, up at me. My throat constricted as ice-cold realization flooded through me. They weren't just standing there. They were watching me, had been watching me this entire time. The book slipped from my numb fingers, landing with a dull thud that seemed deafening in the silence of my apartment. I should have called the police, should have drawn my curtains immediately, and locked myself in my bedroom. Instead, I found myself rising from my chair, drawn toward the window by a compulsion I couldn't explain. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me closer to the glass, closer to that dark figure whose face I still couldn't make out beneath their hood. As I approached, the shadows beneath that had seemed to deepen, to swirl like ink in water. Where features should have been, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to pull at my vision and my consciousness. Yet I knew with bone-deep certainty that it was looking directly at me. I could feel its gaze like a physical weight pressing against my skin. My breath fogged the glass, and I jerked back, suddenly aware of how close I'd gotten to the window. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtains, fingers tangling in the heavy fabric. with one sharp motion. I yanked them closed, cutting off my view of the street below. The room felt colder now, though my heating hadn't clicked off. I backed away from the window, trying to slow my ragged breathing, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. It was just someone standing on a public street. There was nothing inherently threatening about. A shadow fell across the curtain. It was larger now, impossibly larger, as if the figure had somehow crossed the street and risen to my second-floor window without making a sound. The shadow pressed against the fabric, distorting it slightly. I could see the outline of what might have been a hand, reaching, searching, sliding across the curtain as if testing its substance. I stumbled backward, knocking over my reading lamp. The bulb shattered as it hit the floor, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the dim light filtering through the curtain. The shadow seemed darker now, more substantial. Was the curtain bulging inward, or was my terror-stricken mind playing tricks on me? My shoulder blades hit the far wall. I fumbled for my phone with trembling fingers, nearly dropping it twice before managing to activate the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the curtain window, and the shadow was gone. Several minutes passed before I could convince my legs to move. I approached the window with halting steps, my phone's light leading the way. My free hand gripped the curtain, holding it for what felt like an eternity before I found the courage to pull it back. The street below was empty. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist, and the streetlight flickered once, twice, before settling back into its steady glow. Relief flooded through me, making my knees weak. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, allowing my racing heart to slow. That's when I saw them. Leading up to my front door was a trail of muddy footprints, each one darker and wetter than the last. They weren't the random patterns left by passing pedestrians. These were deliberate, purposeful steps that led directly to my stoop. The final print was only partially visible, as if its maker had stopped mid-stride, or stepped inside. From somewhere below me, barely audible over the sound of rain and my own pounding heart, came the soft creak of floorboards. I'm still at my window now, writing this on my phone. The creaking has stopped, but I know what that means. They're no longer moving. They're waiting, just like they waited under the streetlight, patient and still as death. My bedroom door is locked, but I can see a shadow in the gap underneath, darker than the darkness around it. It's not moving, but I know it's watching me, still watching me. And I know with terrible certainty that eventually I'll have to look away. Chapter 8, the morning air was crisp and cool as we stepped out of the house. The sun had barely risen, casting soft, golden light over the neighborhood. It was my day off, and I wanted to spend some time with Emily, my little girl. She'd been so excited the night before, jumping up and down when I promised her a trip to the park. After a long week at work, I needed this, a simple, peaceful morning, just the two of us. I held her tiny hand as we walked down the quiet street, her bright laughter filling the silence. The park was only a few blocks away. We usually went in the afternoons when the sun was high and the place was teeming with children. But today, I wanted to beat the crowds. I craved the stillness, the quietness of the early hour. Emily skipped along beside me, her little backpack bouncing against her back. When we arrived, the playground was empty, just as I'd hoped. The swings hung motionless, and the slides glistened with morning dew. The park had always felt familiar, safe even, but in the quiet of dawn, it seemed different. The trees cast long shadows over the empty benches, and a slight breeze whispered through the leaves, stirring something deep inside me, something I couldn't quite place. Emily didn't notice, of course. She ran toward the swings with her usual boundless energy, her laughter echoing in the stillness. I smiled and sat down on a nearby bench, watching her. She was so full of life, her joy infectious. The sky was clear, the air fresh. It was a perfect morning. But then I heard it, the faint sound of children laughing. At first, I thought it must be an echo of Emily's giggles, but it was different. It sounded distant, as if it were coming from beyond the trees, deep within the park. I looked around, expecting to see another family arriving, but there was no one, just us. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing more than a trick of the wind, maybe the sound of birds in the distance. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the morning sun wash over me. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The laughter. Children's laughter, but not Emily's. I opened my eyes, scanning the park more carefully now, but still, we were alone. Emily was the only child here. She was still on the swing, giggling to herself as she pumped her little legs back and forth. Yet, that laughter, soft and eerie, lingered in the air, as if invisible children were playing just out of sight. A shiver crawled up my spine. Maybe someone was nearby, hidden behind the trees or in the bushes. I stood up, my eyes narrowing, trying to focus on the source of the sound. But there was no movement, no other voices, just that strange, disembodied laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I walked toward Emily, my heart beating a little faster than before. "Hey, sweetheart," I called, trying to keep my voice light. "How about we try the slide?" She didn't respond. Instead, she stopped swinging, her feet dragging in the sand as she looked over her shoulder at the empty swing next to her. "Daddy," she said in that innocent sing-song voice of hers. "This is my new friend." I froze. The swing next to her began to move, slowly at first, then more deliberately, as if someone I couldn't see, was pushing it. "Emily," I said, my voice a little shakier than I intended. "Who are you talking to?" She turned to me, her big blue eyes wide with excitement. "My friend, Daddy. She wants to play with me." There was no one there. The swing kept moving higher and higher, though the wind had died completely. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Emily," I said, forcing a smile, "it's just us here. There's no one else." She frowned, looking at the swing and then back at me. "But she's right here, Daddy. Can't you see her?" I shook my head. A cold sweat began to form on my skin. "No, sweetheart, I can't." Her smile faded, and she hopped off the swing, running toward the merry-go-round. "She wants to go on the merry-go-round now," she called back to me, her voice filled with childish glee. I watched in disbelief as the merry-go-round began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, even though Emily hadn't touched it yet. She stood a few feet away, laughing and clapping, as if watching her invisible friend play. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just my imagination. There was someone here with us. I took a step forward, my mouth dry, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emily," I called, my voice cracking slightly. "We should go. It's getting late." "But we just got here," she protested, her face lighting up with joy as she spun around with the merry-go-round. "My friend doesn't want me to leave." I was about to argue, to grab her and head for the car, when I heard it again, this time much closer. Laughter, not just one child now, but several. The sound surrounded us, echoing from every corner of the playground. I spun around, my eyes scanning the empty park, the deserted streets beyond. No one at all. And then I saw them. At first, they were just faint outlines, barely visible in the morning light. But as I blinked, they became clearer children, ghostly, translucent children, running toward Emily, their faces twisted into wide, unnatural grins. Their laughter grew louder, shrill, and high-pitched, like nails scraping against glass. My blood ran cold. "Emily, get away from there," I shouted, sprinting toward her. She looked at me, confused, her head tilting slightly to the side, as if she didn't understand why I was so scared. "They just want to play," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I grabbed her by the arm, pulling her away from the merry-go-round. The ghostly children were closer now, their eyes dark, their laughter echoing in my ears, louder, more insistent. They surrounded us, their hands outstretched, reaching for Emily. "We're leaving. Now!" I yanked her toward the park entrance, my heart racing, panic surging through me. Emily stumbled, trying to keep up, her small legs struggling to match my pace. The laughter followed us, growing louder, more frantic. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. Dozens of ghostly figures, all running after us. Their faces contorted into grotesque masks of joy. They were getting closer, too close. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the car keys in my pocket. The car was only a few feet away, parked just outside the playground. I shoved Emily into the back seat, slamming the door behind her. I scrambled into the driver's seat, my fingers trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition. The car roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the parking lot, the tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The laughter faded as we drove away, but the fear clung to me, heavy and suffocating. For a few moments, there was only silence. I could hear my own ragged breathing, feel the hammering of my heart in my chest. I glanced at Emily in the rearview mirror. She was sitting quietly, her eyes wide, staring out the window. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "We're okay now." She was quiet for a moment, her little hands gripping the seatbelt tightly. Then, in the smallest, most innocent voice, she whispered, "They're coming with us." I froze. My heart stopped. "What did you say?" She didn't answer, but slowly, she turned her head toward the empty seat beside her. And there, in the reflection of the rear-view mirror, I saw it, a small, ghostly handprint pressed against the window. Chapter 9, The Night Air, had an unusual bite to it as I left the university. It wasn't the cold. November always came with a chill, but something about that evening felt off. I had stayed late for an evening study session, and now the campus, usually alive with students and noise, was eerily quiet. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck and headed toward the bus stop. The streets were deserted, the silence punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind rustling the dry leaves on the sidewalk. The bus stop was empty when I arrived. I checked my phone, 10:45 p.m. I had just missed the last rush, and I knew I'd be waiting a while. It was one of those nights where the world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When the bus finally pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness, I felt a small wave of relief. I stepped inside, greeted by the stale warmth that always seemed to cling to public transportation. The driver, a middle-aged man with deep-set eyes, barely glanced at me as I swiped my card and moved down the aisle. I was surprised to see the bus was almost completely empty. It wasn't unusual for a late-night ride, but it still gave me an odd sense of isolation. There was only one other passenger, a figure sitting at the very back. They were hunched over, their face obscured by the shadows. I hesitated for a moment before choosing a seat a few rows from the front, close enough to the driver that I could at least feel connected to the world outside. The bus rumbled to life and began its slow crawl through the darkened streets. I leaned back, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. There was something strange about that passenger at the back of the bus. From the corner of my eye, I could just make out their form, motionless, slumped. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they had fallen asleep. But something gnawed at me, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't explain. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through meaningless posts to distract myself. Yet every few minutes, I found my eyes drifting toward the back of the bus. They still hadn't moved. As we passed through the next few stops, no one else got on. The bus would idle at each stop, its engine growling softly as if waiting for passengers that never came. Every time, I felt my heart quicken as the doors slid open with a hiss, followed by a heavy, expectant silence. But no one ever boarded, and the doors would close again with a soft thud. I glanced at the driver, wondering if he found this as unnerving as I did. But his expression was blank, eyes fixed ahead as if he were in a trance. About halfway through the route, the bus pulled to a stop at a dimly lit intersection. We sat there, idling, for what felt like an eternity. The bus's interior lights flickered slightly, casting brief, sharp shadows across the empty seats. Outside, the street was desolate, not a single car in sight. I couldn't take it anymore. The figure at the back still hadn't moved, not even a twitch. I strained my ears to hear any sign of breathing, but the low hum of the bus's engine drowned out everything else. Something about their stillness seemed unnatural, as though they weren't simply sleeping. They were too still, too rigid, like a mannequin, or I stopped that thought before it could finish, my heart racing. I couldn't sit there any longer, not with that creeping sense of dread tightening around me. I had to know. Slowly, I stood up, my legs shaking slightly as I made my way toward the back of the bus. Each step felt heavier than the last, my shoes making soft, hollow thuds on the rubber floor. The figure was hunched over, face obscured by a hood or a hat. I couldn't tell which. Their clothes looked oddly old-fashioned, like something out of another time. My stomach twisted in knots as I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I was close enough now to reach out and touch them, but something told me not to. I cleared my throat. "Hey, you okay?" No response. I stepped closer, my hand hovering inches from their shoulder. "Hey!" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right?" Still nothing. I leaned down slightly, trying to get a better look at their face, but the shadows clung to them like a second skin, refusing to give anything away. My pulse was pounding in my ears, a steady drumbeat of fear. Then the bus jerked forward and I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the seat. The figure didn't move, not even a flinch. It was as if they were glued to the seat, a statue frozen in place. A cold, creeping dread settled over me. I had to get out of there. Without another word, I turned and hurried back to my seat, my heart hammering in my chest. I felt their presence behind me, like a weight pressing down on the air, suffocating. The back of my neck prickled, as though I could feel their eyes, if they even had eyes, boring into me. I sat down, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look back. I didn't want to see whatever was sitting there, didn't want to acknowledge the wrongness of it. The bus continued its journey, winding through increasingly unfamiliar streets. I glanced out the window, hoping to see some landmark, some familiar sign to ground me. But everything looked wrong. The buildings were too tall, too narrow, leaning in on themselves like crooked teeth. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. I pressed a button to signal my stop, desperate to get off, but the driver didn't slow down. The bus rumbled past my usual stop without even pausing. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shaking. "I think you missed my stop." The driver didn't respond. I pressed the button again, more urgently this time. Still, the bus kept going, plunging deeper into the night. Panic surged in my chest. "Hey!" I stood up, grabbing onto the pole to keep my balance as the bus swayed. "You missed my stop. Let me off." The driver remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I could see his face in the rear-view mirror, blank, expressionless, as if he hadn't even heard me. My heart raced as I made my way to the front of the bus, gripping the pole tightly to steady myself. "I need to get off," I said, my voice rising with fear. Finally, the driver turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his eyes. They were dull, lifeless, like the eyes of a doll. "We're almost there," he said, his voice hollow, mechanical. "Almost where?" I asked, panic lacing my words. "Where are we going?" He didn't answer. The bus continued to rumble forward, taking me deeper into unfamiliar streets, past towering buildings that seemed to lean in closer with each passing second. I rushed to the doors, pressing the emergency button to open them, but nothing happened. They remained locked, sealed shut. I pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but the street outside was empty, desolate. Not a single soul in sight. I turned to the driver again. "Let me off! Now!" His eyes flickered to the mirror, and I followed his gaze back to the figure at the rear of the bus. They were standing now. My stomach dropped, my entire body tensing with fear. The figure hadn't moved for the entire ride, and now they were standing, facing me. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body, still cloaked in shadow. The bus lurched, and the lights flickered, plunging the bus into brief darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure had moved closer. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away, my hands shaking. What the hell is this? The driver didn't respond. The figure took another step forward, slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. My heart pounded in my chest. My pulse a deafening roar in my ears. I pressed myself against the door, frantically trying to find a way out, but the bus kept moving, carrying me further into the darkness. The figure moved closer still, their footsteps eerily silent on the floor. The lights flickered again. Darkness. When the lights came back on, they were right in front of me. I couldn't breathe. My entire body was frozen in place, trapped between terror and disbelief. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, their hand inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the touch. And then, the bus screeched to a halt. The sudden stop threw me forward, and I stumbled, falling to the floor. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I scrambled to my feet, my heart still racing, and looked around wildly. The bus was empty. The doors hissed open, and the driver turned to me, his expression still blank. Last stop. I looked out the doors. The bus had stopped in the middle of nowhere in empty, desolate streets surrounded by crumbling buildings. There was no sign of life, no sound but the soft rustle of the wind as it swept through the narrow streets, kicking up dust and debris. The place was completely unfamiliar, a landscape stripped of any recognizable features. My heart hammered in my chest as I took in the scene outside, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. "This isn't my stop," I stammered, my voice shaking. "Where the hell are we?" The driver didn't respond. His face remained a mask of indifference, his dead eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking. It was like he couldn't even hear me, or didn't care. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. There was no way I was getting off the bus in this place. It was too quiet, too empty. Everything about it screamed danger, as though the very air here was wrong. I could feel it, like an electric charge against my skin, prickling and unsettling. But staying on the bus felt even worse. The figure, the one that had stood right in front of me, reaching out, it had disappeared. Or maybe it was hiding, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to appear again. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I took a step forward, toward the open doors, my feet feeling like lead. The chill of the night air hit me as I stepped down onto the pavement, but I didn't feel any relief. The door slid shut behind me with a soft, mechanical hiss, and the bus's engine rumbled as it began to pull away, leaving me standing alone in the street. I watched it disappear around a corner, the taillights fading into the distance. I was alone now, completely alone. The silence was suffocating. I glanced around, hoping to see something, anything, that would give me a sense of where I was. But the streets were deserted, lined with crumbling buildings that looked like they had been abandoned for years. The windows were dark, shattered in some places, and the lampposts overhead flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. There was no sign of life. No cars, no people. Nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my fear only deepened. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place. It was as if the world around me was holding its breath, waiting. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Each step felt like a mistake, like I was trespassing in a place I didn't belong. The buildings loomed over me, their dark windows like empty eyes watching my every move. The further I walked, the more disoriented I became. Every street looked the same, long, empty stretches of cracked pavement lined with decaying structures. It was as though I had stepped into a different world, one that was decaying and forgotten. I kept turning corners, hoping to find some familiar landmark, some sign of normalcy, but it was useless. There was nothing here but more empty streets and broken buildings. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence. I nearly jumped, my nerves shot from the tension. I pulled it out quickly, relief flooding through me as I saw a notification. But when I unlocked the screen, my relief turned to confusion. There was a message, one I hadn't heard come in. Are you lost? I stared at it, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't texted anyone. No one knew where I was. My hands trembled as I typed a response. Who is this? I waited, my breath caught in my throat. The seconds stretched out, each one longer than the last. Then another message appeared. I see you. I felt the blood drain from my face. My eyes darted around the street, scanning the shadows, the dark windows, the narrow alleys. But there was no one, not a single soul. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of here. I had to find my way back. But every direction I turned, every street I walked, led me deeper into the same twisted maze of desolation. The phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Turn around. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, I turned. At the far end of the street, I saw a figure. They were standing perfectly still, shrouded in shadows. The same figure from the bus. My heart lurched as I recognized the shape. The same unmoving posture. The same eerie stillness. They were watching me. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I spun around and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement. The sound of my own heartbeat deafening in my ears. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The streets blurred as I ran, my legs burning with the effort, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The air felt heavier, thicker with every step, as if the world itself was closing in on me. Then, as I rounded another corner, I skidded to a halt. The figure was there again, standing in the middle of the street, waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was no escape. No matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, they were always ahead of me, always waiting. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with fear. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure began to move, slow and deliberate, walking toward me with a calm, measured pace. I backed away, my hands trembling as I clutched my phone, but I knew it was useless. I was trapped. The figure stopped a few feet away, their face still obscured by shadows. I could feel the weight of their gaze, feel the coldness radiating from them, and then, in a voice that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere, they spoke. This is your stop. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The world around me seemed to twist, the buildings warping and bending in impossible ways. The ground shifted beneath my feet, and the sky darkened, the faint streetlights flickering out one by one. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I was standing in the middle of an empty street, the cold wind biting at my skin. The bus was gone. The figure was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained. It clung to me like a shadow, following me with every step I took, every breath I made. I didn't know where I was, or how I would get back. All I knew was that I wasn't alone. Chapter 10, we had been searching for months, open houses, weekend tours, endless scrolling through real estate apps. Every place we visited felt wrong in some way. Too small, too old, too expensive. So, When we stumbled upon a house on the outskirts of town, nestled between a patch of woods and a quiet road, we thought we'd found our haven. It was perfect. The house had this old charm, a sense of history that felt alive in the worn wooden floors, the creak of the staircase, and the slant of the sun through the large windows. Mia and I couldn't stop grinning as we wandered from room to room. 3 bedrooms, a big kitchen with a view of the woods, and even a small basement for storage. It felt like fate had finally smiled on us. The first few days were bliss. Unpacking our boxes, decorating the walls with photographs and art, filling the place with the scent of new beginnings. Every evening, we'd sit in the living room with a glass of wine, talking about the future we'd build here. Our future. It felt like nothing could spoil it, until the night we found the door. It started innocently enough. We were rearranging some old furniture in the basement. Mia had found a vintage dresser she wanted to restore, and as we moved it aside, something caught my eye. The wall behind the dresser looked wrong. There was an odd seam, like the outline of a door, hidden in the wood paneling. I leaned closer, running my fingers along the edges. Sure enough, there was a small, almost imperceptible gap in the wall. "Babe, come look at this," I called out. Mia came down the stairs, her brow furrowed as she approached. "What is it?" I pointed to the seam. "I think it's a door." Her eyes widened. "That's weird. It wasn't on the floor plan, was it?" "No," I replied, a cold ripple of unease threading through my chest. It wasn't. We stared at it for a moment, the silence of the basement pressing in around us. The air felt different down there now, heavier somehow, as if the discovery of the door had shifted something in the house's atmosphere. Mia knelt beside the wall, tracing her fingers along the wood. "There's no handle," she said softly. "It's sealed." "Maybe it's just an old storage space," I suggested, trying to sound casual, though I didn't believe my own words. Something about it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to have found it. "We should leave it," Mia said, standing up and brushing off her hands. "Let's just forget about it." But that night, I couldn't forget. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind fixating on the door in the basement. Why was it hidden? Why hadn't the realtor mentioned it? More importantly, what was behind it? Days passed, and though we tried to settle back into our routine, the presence of the door lingered like a shadow over everything we did. I would catch Mia glancing toward the basement door during dinner, her eyes dark with unspoken questions. And at night, I started hearing things. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. A soft, scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere deep below us. I would lie still in bed, straining to hear it over the thud of my heartbeat. But every time I tried to listen, it would stop, fading into the silence of the house. Then came the whispers. They were so faint, I thought I was imagining them at first. A low, unintelligible murmur, just at the edge of my hearing. Mia didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did, but chose to ignore it. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the more I heard, the harder it became to dismiss. One night, I woke to the sound of something moving below us. Not a scurry, not the hum of the house settling, but a deliberate noise, like someone dragging their hand across the walls of the basement. My heart pounded as I sat up, listening, holding my breath. "Mia," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Do you hear that?" She blinked groggily, listening for a moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, she turned away. "It's just the house," she mumbled half asleep. "Go back to bed." But I couldn't. The noises continued over the next few nights, growing louder, more distinct. I became obsessed, spending hours in the basement during the day, running my hands over the hidden door, tapping at the walls, trying to figure out how to open it. It felt like the house was daring me, challenging me to unlock whatever lay behind that door. Then one night, I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm opening it," I said, my voice tense with determination. Mia was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes wide as she looked up at me. "What?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're not serious, are you?" "I am." "I can't keep ignoring it. Something's behind that door, and I need to know what." She stood up, fear flashing across her face. "We don't need to do this. It's not our problem. Just let it be." But I was beyond reason. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and made my way to the basement, Mia following behind me reluctantly, her face pale with worry. The door was waiting, hidden in the shadows behind the old dresser. I wedged the crowbar into the gap and began prying at the edges. There was creaking and groaning under the pressure. Mia stood back, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to ward off the chill that seemed to fill the basement. With a final crack, the panel gave way and the door swung open. Behind it was a narrow, dark passageway that stretched into the distance, disappearing into blackness. The air that seeped out was cold and stale, like a crypt long forgotten. I could feel it then, the weight of something watching us from the darkness. Mia gasped, stepping back. "What the hell is this?" I stared into the passageway, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know," I whispered, the words barely audible over the blood rushing in my ears. Against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I stepped inside. The walls were rough stone, damp to the touch, and the narrowness of the space made it feel like the air was pressing in on me. Mia hesitated at the threshold, fear etched in her features. "We shouldn't go in," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, let's just close it and forget this ever happened." But I couldn't stop myself. I was driven by a compulsion I didn't fully understand. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper and deeper beneath the house, as though it led into the bowels of the earth. I kept moving, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but more stone walls. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, faint at first but unmistakable. It came from somewhere ahead of us, echoing off the walls. Mia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, a low, unintelligible murmur, like a chorus of voices speaking all at once. And then from behind us, I heard the door slam shut with a deafening thud. We both spun around, our flashlight beams cutting through the dark, but there was nothing there. The way back was sealed, the door gone. Panic surged through me as I ran back to where the door had been, pounding on the stone wall with my fist. "No! No! No! No!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the narrow space. Mia was breathing heavily, her back pressed against the wall, eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," she gasped, clutching my arm. "We need to go. Now." But before I could respond, the whispers turned into a soft, scratching sound, like nails dragging across stone. It was coming from the passage ahead, moving toward us, slow but deliberate. My blood turned to ice. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Mia's hand. "Run." We bolted, sprinting down the narrow passage as the scratching grew louder, closer. The air was freezing now, each breath burning in my lungs. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as we ran, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was chasing us. The passage twisted and turned, the walls closing in tighter, the ceiling lowering. It felt like the entire house was collapsing in on us, trying to trap us within its dark heart. My mind was a blur of fear. My only thought to keep running, to get away from whatever was coming for us. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, we stumbled into a room. It was small and circular, the walls lined with what looked like old, rusted metal. There was no way out, no door, no window, just cold stone and darkness. Mia's sobs filled the room as she collapsed to the floor. "We're trapped," she whispered. "We're going to die here." I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was staring me in the face. There was no escape. The scratching sound was at the entrance of the room now, slow and deliberate. I could feel the presence. Something inhuman, something ancient, waiting just beyond the threshold. The air had grown thick, oppressive, as if the very walls of the room were breathing, inhaling our fear. Mia clutched at me, her nails digging into my skin as she sobbed uncontrollably. But I couldn't comfort her, not when every fiber of my being was screaming in terror. I spun in place, frantically searching for any way out, any crack in the walls, any small gap that might offer escape, but the room was sealed tight. It was like we had wandered into the heart of a nightmare, and the only thing left was to wait for the inevitable. And then, the whispers began again. They were closer now, louder, distinct voices weaving together in a terrifying harmony of madness. It wasn't just noise, it was words, though I couldn't make them out. The voices were ancient, guttural, speaking in a language I didn't understand. But even without knowing the words, I could feel their malice, their hunger. The scratching stopped, replaced by heavy, wet footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Something was coming for us. I backed away from the doorway, pulling Mia with me, my pulse thundering in my ears. "We have to move," I whispered hoarsely. "We can't stay here." "Where?" she cried, her eyes wide with panic. "There's nowhere to go." I didn't have an answer. The room seemed to shrink around us, the metal walls cold against my back. The darkness outside the room thickened, swirling, as though it had a life of its own. And then, from that swirling blackness, I saw it, just a glimpse at first. A figure. No, not a figure. A thing. Its form was barely human, elongated. Its limbs unnaturally stretched and twisted. Its face, if you could call it a face, was hidden in shadow, but I could see the gleam of pale, reflective eyes watching us. I could feel its presence deep in my bones, a coldness that sank into my core. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, suffocating us under its weight. "Mia," I whispered, barely able to speak. "Don't look at it." But it was too late. She had already seen. Her breath hitched in her throat, her eyes wide with terror as the thing stepped closer. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a sound that felt like the scraping of iron against stone, a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. I grabbed Mia by the arm and pulled her toward the far corner of the room, as far from the doorway as we could get. But I knew it wouldn't matter. There was no way out, no place to run. The thing stepped into the room, its movement slow, deliberate, like it was savoring our fear. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but I was frozen. My legs felt like lead, my body numb with terror. Mia sobbed beside me, clutching my arms so tightly I thought she might break bone. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The thing was getting closer, its shadow falling over us like a suffocating blanket. And then the room began to change. The walls around us, those rusted metal surfaces, began to shift and ripple as though they were made of liquid. I could hear the groaning of the stone, the creaking of ancient foundations shifting under the weight of some unseen force. The passageway we had come from, where the thing had emerged, seemed to collapse in on itself, folding into the shadows like it had never been there. I turned my head, desperate, and saw something impossible. The room was transforming before my eyes. Where there had been no door, no window, I now saw a faint outline, a familiar one, the door from the basement, the forgotten door that had brought us into this nightmare. But how? It had disappeared, vanished from our sight. Without thinking, I yanked Mia to her feet. "We have to go. Now." Her eyes were wild with terror, but she followed me, stumbling toward the impossible door. The creature, whatever it was, lurched after us, moving faster now, a low growl reverberating from its chest. The door was right in front of us, inches away, but it felt like it was miles out of reach. I could feel the creature's presence just behind us, its cold breath on the back of my neck. I slammed into the door, praying it would open, and to my astonishment it did. The hinges creaked as it swung open, revealing our basement, the same basement we had been in just hours before. I grabbed Mia and we scrambled through the doorway, slamming it shut behind us. We stood there, panting, pressed against the door, waiting for it to burst open, waiting for the thing to tear through the flimsy wood and drag us back into the darkness. But nothing happened. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking as I held the door closed. Mia sobbed quietly beside me, her whole body trembling. But there was no scratching, no whispers. The door didn't rattle, didn't move. It was over. Slowly, I stepped back, turning to look at the door. My heart was still pounding, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. But I had to know. It was gone. The door, the passage, the whole thing. Where the hidden door had been, there was now just a solid wall with paneling, as though nothing had ever been there. My mind struggled to comprehend it. I ran my hands over the wall, searching for the seam, the gap, anything. But there was nothing. No sign of the nightmare we had just lived through. Mia sank to the floor, her face pale and streaked with tears. "What the hell just happened?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. My own hands were trembling as I backed away from the wall. It was like the house had swallowed the passageway hole, wiping away any trace of what we had seen. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." Mia nodded weakly, still sitting on the floor, her face a mask of shock. I helped her up, and together, we stumbled back upstairs, too numb to process what had just happened. As we reached the living room, something caught my eye. A framed photo of us on the mantel, taken the day we moved in. It had shifted slightly, as if it had been moved, tilted at an odd angle. My stomach twisted with unease. I glanced around the room, my pulse quickening. Everything looked normal, just as we had left it. But there was a weight in the air now, a lingering presence, like the house was watching us, waiting. We were back in the living room. We were safe. But the door, it had never been there. Had it? As Mia sat down on the couch, her hands still shaking, I stood in the center of the room listening. For a moment, I thought I heard it again, faint, barely audible. A whisper. It was coming from beneath us, from the basement. Chapter 11, I inherited the dollhouse after my grandmother passed away. It was one of the few things left of me in her will, though I wasn't sure why. I hadn't been particularly close to her, not like my cousins, but for some reason, she left me that old, intricate thing. When the movers brought it into my apartment, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. It was beautiful, no doubt. A perfect miniature Victorian-style home, complete with tiny furniture and hand-painted figurines. It had stood in my grandmother's house for as long as I could remember, tucked away in the corner of her parlor, always watching from its shadowy spot. As a child, I never dared touch it. There was something about its delicate beauty that had always made me nervous, like I didn't belong near it. Now, it was mine, sitting in the center of my living room, demanding attention. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a dollhouse. After all, wood and glass, a relic of my grandmother's past. But still, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that hung in the air since it arrived. The weight of it seemed too much for such a small thing, like the atmosphere around it was heavier somehow. I set it up on a small table near the window and tried to move on, focusing on work and daily life. For the first few days, I barely noticed it, though I always felt its presence looming in the corner of my vision. Every time I passed through the living room, my eyes would dart toward it, as if expecting something to be different. But it was always the same, a perfectly frozen snapshot of another time. Then, one evening, something changed. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels, when I glanced over at the dollhouse. Something seemed off, though I couldn't place it at first. I got up and walked over. peering inside the small rooms. The tiny kitchen, the living room, the bedrooms, everything was still perfectly arranged, just as it had been when I'd first set it up. But the dolls, the little figurines that represented the house's inhabitants, they weren't where I remembered placing them. I'd only looked at the dolls briefly when I'd first inherited the house. Two parents, a small child, and a maid, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes. The parents had been seated in the tiny living room when I unpacked the house. The child in her bedroom upstairs, the maid in the kitchen. But now, the father was standing by the front door, as though about to leave, and the mother was standing at the top of the stairs, her tiny face turned toward the front of the house. I stared at them, heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't moved them. I was sure of it. Shaking my head, I brushed it off as forgetfulness. Maybe I had moved them without thinking when I unpacked the house. Maybe the cleaning lady had accidentally bumped them when she dusted. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Over the next few days, the feeling only intensified. Every time I looked at the dollhouse, something was different. The dolls would shift positions subtly, almost imperceptibly. One day, the child was sitting at the tiny dining table. The next, she was by the window, looking out into the dollhouse's miniature backyard. The father moved constantly, sometimes standing in the hallway, sometimes near the stairs, always with his face turned toward the front door, as though he were waiting for something or someone. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, stressed from work. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the dollhouse continued to draw me in, demanding my attention with its silent, shifting figures. Then things started happening in my apartment. It began with small things, items out of place, just like the dolls. A book I'd left on the coffee table would end up on the bookshelf. My keys, usually in the bowl by the door, would be on the kitchen counter. At first, I chalked it up to absent-mindedness. But as the days passed, the incidents became harder to ignore. One morning, I woke to find all the chairs in my dining room pulled away from the table, perfectly spaced as though someone had set them up for a meeting. I hadn't touched them the night before. My heart raced as I walked through the apartment, trying to piece together some logical explanations, but nothing made sense. The dollhouse sat in the corner, untouched, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow responsible. The dolls inside had shifted again. The father was now standing at the dollhouse's front door, halfway out, as though about to step into my living room. I didn't know why I kept going back to the dollhouse. Each time I checked, it only fueled my growing paranoia. But I couldn't stop myself. It was late one night when I discovered the worst of it. I had been lying in bed, restless, my thoughts consumed by the dollhouse and the strange occurrences in my home. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of soft tapping, a rhythmic, deliberate knock. I sat up, my heart racing. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like someone tapping their fingernails against glass. I followed the noise to the living room, my skin crawling with unease. There in the darkness, the dollhouse sat, illuminated only by the dim light from the street outside. I approached it slowly, dread settling over me like a blanket. The dolls had moved again, but this time there was something new. In the tiny bedroom on the second floor, standing by the miniature window, was a doll I hadn't seen before. My stomach twisted as I leaned in for a closer look. The doll. It was me. It stood there, facing the tiny window, dressed in clothes identical to the ones I had worn that day. Every detail was perfect. The messy bun in my hair, the thin chain I always wore around my neck. I stared at the tiny version of myself, disbelief and terror warring inside me. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the tiny figure. The moment I did, a cold shock ran up my arm, and I jerked my hand away as it burned. The doll's head turned ever so slightly, its tiny glass eyes meeting mine. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Panicking, I grabbed the dollhouse and yanked it off the table, sending the tiny furniture and dolls scattering across the floor. The small pieces bounced and rolled away, but the moment they hit the ground, something impossible happened. They began to move. The dolls, every single one, scrambled back into position as though pulled by invisible strings. I watched horrified as they righted themselves, the father returning to his post by the door, the mother to the stairs. But worst of all was the doll version of me, which calmly stood up from where it had fallen and returned to the bedroom window, turning to face me once again. My hands shook with fear and adrenaline as I backed away from the dollhouse. I had to get rid of it. I had to destroy it. With trembling hands, I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox in the closet and raised it high, ready to smash the cursed thing to pieces. But just as I brought the hammer down, something stopped me. The dolls moved quickly, impossibly fast, grabbing hold of my wrist. Tiny, cold hands wrapped around my fingers, my knuckles, locking me in place. I struggled, but the more I fought, the tighter their grip became, their small, porcelain faces expressionless as they held me down. My heart pounded in my chest, panic rising as I realized I couldn't break free. They were too strong, too determined. I dropped the hammer with a clatter, gasping for breath as I yanked my hands free, the skin on my wrist raw and red. The dolls returned to their positions, the tiny version of me staring blankly from the window. I stumbled back, my legs weak, barely able to stand. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the doll's gaze on me, watching from the corner of the room. I couldn't escape it. Couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in my own home. When morning finally came, I dragged myself out of bed, exhausted and terrified. I glanced at the dollhouse, dreading what I might find. The doll version of me was gone. I searched every inch of the house, turning over the tiny furniture, checking each room, each shadow, but it had vanished, as though it had never existed. The rest of the dolls remained in their usual places, eerily still, their blank eyes staring at nothing. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As I turned to leave the room, something caught my eye, a reflection in the glass of the dollhouse's front door. It was me. I wasn't standing in my living room anymore. I was inside the dollhouse, trapped behind the glass, staring out at the world I had once known. I screamed, but no sound came. Chapter 12, when we first saw the house, it felt like a dream come true, set in the quiet countryside, far from the chaos of the city. It was everything we had been looking for. Tall trees framed the property, and wildflowers dotted the field leading up to the front porch. The paint was peeling, and the roof sagged in places, but we didn't mind. It was old, but that only added to its charm. "This is it, James," Claire had said, her voice filled with excitement. "We can make this our home." And I had agreed. The house had a warmth to it, a quiet sense of history in its creaking floors and weathered walls. It felt like a place where we could start fresh, away from the noise and stress of our lives. We bought it without hesitation, already making plans for renovations, fixing up the kitchen, updating the floors, maybe even knocking down a wall or two to open up the space. The first few weeks were blissful. We spent our days painting, unpacking, and talking about what we would do next. At night, we would sit on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, feeling like we had escaped the world. But then, little by little, the whispers began. It started one evening while I was working late in the living room. Claire had already gone to bed, and I was sorting through boxes, trying to find an old photo album we had packed away. The house was silent. The only sound the faint creak of the wood as it settled in the cool night air. And then I heard it, soft, barely noticeable at first, a faint whisper, like a breeze passing through the cracks in the walls. I stopped what I was doing, listening, but the sound faded, leaving only silence behind. I shook my head and brushed it off. Old houses made strange noises after all, Creaks, groans, drafts. It was part of the charm, wasn't it? But over the next few days, the whispers grew more distinct. It was always when I was alone, whether I was in the kitchen, the hallway, or the upstairs bedroom. I would hear them. Faint voices, just on the edge of my hearing. Too soft to make out, but impossible to ignore. At first, I thought it was Claire, maybe talking in her sleep, but whenever I checked, she was fast asleep or completely unaware of the noise. I didn't mention it at first, not wanting to worry her. But then one night, we were sitting in the dining room, discussing renovation plans over dinner, when Claire suddenly stopped talking, her fork halfway to her mouth. Her eyes widened, and she glanced toward the wall beside her. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Hear what?" She put her fork down slowly, staring at the wall. It sounded like someone whispering. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "I've been hearing it too," I admitted, my voice low. But I thought it was just my imagination. Her face paled, and we sat in silence for a moment, both of us listening intently. The house was quiet again, but I could feel it, the presence of something just beyond the walls, watching, waiting. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. They seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, surrounding us. Sometimes they were so faint they were barely there, a distant hum in the air. But other times, they were clear enough that I could almost make out words, though the language was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was guttural, harsh, like something ancient and angry. Claire started losing sleep. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find her sitting up in bed, staring at the walls, her face tense with fear. "They're getting louder," she whispered one night, her voice trembling. I can't stand it, James. It's like they're trying to get in." I tried to comfort her, telling her it was just the wind or the house settling, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The voices were too deliberate, too focused, and they were growing bolder. Then one evening, while we were working on tearing down one of the old walls in the living room for the renovation, we found something that made my blood run cold. As I pulled down a section of drywall, I uncovered a set of strange, jagged symbols carved into the wooden beams beneath. They were crude, almost primitive, and they covered the entire length of the wall, like some kind of ancient script. I stepped back, the hammer slipping from my hand as I stared at the symbols, my mind racing. "What the hell is this?" Claire asked, her voice shaky. She had seen them too, and the fear in her eyes mirrored my own. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "Maybe the previous owners left it behind, some kind of art or..." But even as I said the words, I knew they were alive. The symbols felt wrong, like they didn't belong here, like they were part of something dark and terrible, something that had been hidden for a reason. And that's when the whispers turned into screams. It was sudden, a violent eruption of sound that filled the room, drowning out our thoughts. The voices were no longer distant or soft. They were all around us, crashing against our ears, speaking in that same foreign language, angry and frenzied. It was like they had been unleashed from the walls, free to rage at us for disturbing whatever had been hidden there. Claire screamed, covering her ears, and I grabbed her, pulling her away from the wall. The house began to shake, the floor vibrating beneath our feet, as if the very foundation was coming apart. "We have to get out of here," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. We ran for the front door, but when I grabbed the handle and yanked, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, throwing my weight against it, but it was like the door had fused to the frame. Claire was panicking, her breath coming in short gasps as she tugged at the windows, but they were sealed shut too. Every exit was blocked, as though the house itself had come alive and was holding us captive. The screams grew louder, more desperate, and the walls seemed to pulse, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. I could feel the air growing thick, pressing down on us, suffocating. "This can't be happening," Claire whimpered, tears streaming down her face. We have to get out, James. We have to get out. I grabbed a chair and threw it at the window, hoping to break the glass, but it bounced off harmlessly, leaving not even a scratch. The house was trapping us inside, the walls closing in, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Desperate, I ran back toward the living room, my eyes darting to the symbols. Maybe, just maybe, if we covered them up, if we put the wall back, the voices would stop. I didn't know what else to do, but as I reached for the torn piece of drywall, the ground beneath us shifted violently, knocking me to the floor. The air was filled with dust and debris as the walls seemed to contract, pressing in closer, the whispers now a chaotic storm of sound. I struggled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. We had to escape. I grabbed Claire, pulling her toward the basement door. Maybe, just maybe, we could find another way out. The basement was dark and cold, but it was quiet, blissfully quiet. For a moment, I thought we might have outrun the voices, escaped the house's madness. But then, as we reached the bottom of the stairs, the whispers returned. They were softer now, more measured, as though they were watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I could feel the weight of their presence all around us, pressing against the walls. "We can't stay here," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to get out." I nodded, my eyes scanning the basement for any possible escape. And then I saw it, a small window near the ceiling, just big enough for us to squeeze through. With shaking hands, I helped Claire climb onto a stack of boxes, pushing her up toward the window. She struggled with the latch, her hands trembling, but after what felt like an eternity, it gave way. She crawled through, her body disappearing into the night, and I followed, pulling myself through the tight space and collapsing onto the cold, wet ground outside. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. The moment we sped down the driveway, away from the house, I felt like I could breathe again. But as the house disappeared in the rear-view mirror, the whispers followed. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable over the sound of the engine. But as we drove further, they grew louder, filling the car with their soft, insidious hum. I glanced at Claire, my heart sinking as I realized the truth. The house wasn't letting us go. It had followed us. The whispers, they were coming with us. And with each passing mile, they grew louder. Chapter 13, I had always loved finding unique, vintage pieces to decorate my home. There was something about old objects, about their history, the untold stories that seemed to cling to them. That drew me in. That's why, on a cold, overcast afternoon, I found myself wandering through the narrow streets of an old part of town, stumbling upon a tiny antique shop tucked away between two looming buildings. The sign was barely legible, faded with age. The collector's corner. I pushed the door open, and a bell jingled softly. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves cluttered with odd trinkets and forgotten relics. There were porcelain dolls with cracked faces, tarnished silverware, and old clocks that ticked out of sync. The place felt timeless, as though it had existed in this shadowy corner of the world for centuries, waiting for someone to find it. I walked slowly through the narrow aisles, my fingers trailing over the cool surfaces of forgotten things. I hadn't come with anything specific in mind, just hoping to find something that spoke to me. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the shop, almost hidden behind a towering bookshelf, stood a mirror. It was tall, its frame made of dark, intricately carved wood, but the glass itself was tarnished with age, fogged over like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. There was something about it, something unsettling. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong, even in this shop of forgotten objects. You have an eye for the special pieces. The voice startled me. I hadn't heard the shopkeeper approach. He was an old man, his face gaunt and lined with wrinkles, his eyes dark and gleaming with an intensity that made me uneasy. I wasn't sure if it was for sale, I said, glancing back at the mirror. Oh, it's for sale, he replied, stepping closer. His smile was thin, his teeth yellowed. In fact, I think it's meant for you. I laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. How much is it? He shook his head. No charge. Take it. It's special. I should have refused. Everything inside me told me to walk away, to leave the mirror where it stood. But his words lingered. It's meant for you. And I found myself nodding, agreeing to take it. The shopkeeper didn't say another word as he helped me carry it out to my car. His eyes, however, never left mine, and there was something in his gaze that chilled me to the bone. By the time I got the mirror home, dusk had begun to settle, casting long shadows through the windows. I brought it inside, setting it against the wall in the living room. In the dim light, the tarnished glass seemed even more clouded, the reflection warped and ghostly. I wiped the glass with a cloth, trying to clear away the grime, but no matter how hard I scrubbed, the tarnish wouldn't budge. Still, it had a strange charm to it, a dark elegance that I couldn't quite explain. It seemed to add character to the room, and I quickly convinced myself it was a perfect fit. That night, as I sat on the couch with a book, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. I glanced up at the mirror, expecting to see my own reflection. But what I saw instead made my heart skip a beat. There, just behind me, stood a shadow. It was vague, its outline blurry, like smoke curling in the air, but it was unmistakably there. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. My heart raced as I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was still there, hovering just behind my reflection, darker now, more defined. I blinked, and it was gone. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. It's just a light, I whispered to myself. Just a trick of the light. But as the night wore on, I found myself glancing at the mirror more and more. Each time, the shadow seemed to return, growing bolder, clearer. It lingered just at the edge of my reflection, a figure standing in the background, its form unervingly still. When I finally went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I tried to avoid the mirror, convincing myself that my imagination had been playing tricks on me. But every time I passed by, I felt it, a pull, like the mirror was demanding my attention. And when I did look, the shadow was there, always just behind me, as if it was watching, waiting for something. By the third night, I could barely sleep. Every creak in the house, every shift of the wind outside, set me on edge. I started hearing faint whispers, too low to make out, but enough to send a chill down my spine. They seemed to come from the walls, from the floors, but mostly from the direction of the mirror. I couldn't take it anymore. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard the whisper again. But this time, it was clearer, more distinct. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. It was coming from the living room, from the mirror. I got out of bed, my legs trembling as I walked down the hallway. The house was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, casting a dim reflection in the glass of the mirror. And there was again the shadow. But it wasn't just behind me now. It had moved closer, so close that it seemed to be standing right next to my reflection, its outline darker, more defined. I could almost see the shape of a face, featureless and void, staring back at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, but my reflection remained still, the shadow now stepping out from behind it, closer, looming. I gasped, stumbling back, but the shadow kept coming, moving toward me, stepping out of the glass like it was no longer confined to the mirror. I ran. I bolted down the hallway, my heart racing. But when I reached the bedroom and slammed the door behind me, I knew it wasn't over. The shadow was inside with me. I could feel it, an oppressive weight in the air, a coldness that seeped into my bones. I grabbed a lamp and rushed back to the living room, desperate to end this nightmare. My mind raced as I searched for something, anything, that would stop whatever was happening. The mirror. I had to destroy the mirror. With a trembling hand, I lifted the lamp and swung it at the glass. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, the glass exploding outward, shards flying across the room. For a moment, everything was still. But then, from the shattered pieces of glass, the shadow rose. It reached out from the broken mirror, its fingers, if you could even call them that, curling around my wrist, cold and sharp like ice. I screamed, trying to pull away, but its grip was strong, pulling me closer to the shards that still remained in the frame. My reflection was gone. All I could see now was darkness, an empty, void-like darkness, deeper than anything I had ever seen. And in that void, the shadow gripped me, pulling me closer. I swung the lamp again, smashing the last of the glass, and the shadow released me, retreating into the broken shards. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent again. The mirror lay in pieces on the floor, the shadow seemingly gone. But something was wrong. I turned to face the wall, catching sight of my reflection in a small, intact shard. Only it wasn't there. I stared at the broken piece of glass, but my reflection was gone. Where I should have seen myself, there was nothing but emptiness. Panic surged through me as I ran to the bathroom mirror, but again nothing. No reflection, just empty glass. I backed away, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But as I stepped into the hallway, I saw it, my shadow. It stretched along the floor, following me like it always had, but there was something different about it now. It moved on its own, shifting unnaturally, reaching toward me. I stumbled back, but the shadow followed, its dark fingers stretching toward my feet, crawling up the walls, wrapping around me. I ran outside, desperate for fresh air, desperate to escape. But no matter where I went, the shadows followed. Every dark corner, every flicker of light seemed to hide them, reaching for me, pulling at me. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the night. The world around me had become a prison of shadows, and I was trapped inside. I never should have taken that mirror. Chapter 14, the day we moved into the village. I remember thinking it was the start of something new, something peaceful. After years of city life, traffic, noise, people always in a rush, this isolated village felt like a retreat from the world. The house itself was perfect, too. An old stone building with ivy climbing its walls, nestled at the edge of a thick, ancient forest. It had character, as the realtor had said. A place with history. My wife, Sarah, was ecstatic. She'd always dreamed of living somewhere quiet, surrounded by nature, and this house checked all the boxes. The village was small, with just a few families, and everyone seemed welcoming enough at first. A few neighbors even came by to introduce themselves, offering homemade bread and well-worn smiles. But there was something off about them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. They were all too curious about the house, their questions oddly specific. "How's the old cellar holding up?" one old woman asked, her eyes narrow as she handed Sarah a basket of apples. Another man, tall and gaunt, leaned in closer than necessary when we were talking. "Did you check the foundations yet? Hear anything strange down there?" I had brushed it off as rural superstition, or perhaps just idle curiosity. Old houses had their quirks, and villagers likely had a million stories about the place. But as the days passed, more and more people seemed overly concerned about the cellar. Always the cellar. At first, we laughed it off. Maybe the house has a history of flooding, Sarah joked as we unpacked the last of the boxes. I chuckled, but the back of my mind itched with doubt. That night, after the village had fallen silent and the moon hung low over the trees, we heard it. A faint sound, almost too soft to notice at first. A shuffling, like something moving across the floor, coming from the direction of the cellar door. Sarah and I glanced at each other. Probably just an animal, I muttered, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The sound continued, soft and persistent, like footsteps pacing back and forth below us. But when I opened the cellar door, peering down into the dark stone staircase, there was nothing. Silence. The space below was cold and empty. The next morning, I mentioned it to one of the villagers, an older man who sat outside the local pub, always watching the road that led into the forest. He looked at me, his eyes dark and knowing. "You don't want to be messing with that cellar," he said, his voice low. "Some things are better left alone." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced a smile, not wanting to seem unsettled. "It's just an old house," I said. "Old houses make noises." He didn't respond, just stared at me with that same intense gaze before turning away. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something none of the villagers were telling us. In the days that followed, things got stranger. It started small. Furniture moved slightly from where we had left it. The front door, which we always locked, would swing open in the middle of the night. I'd find Sarah standing in the hallway, staring at the door as if waiting for someone or something to walk in. "Did you leave it unlocked?" she'd ask, though we both knew the answer. And then there were the footsteps, the slow, deliberate steps coming from below the floorboards. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was walking just below our bedroom. The cellar, however, always seemed empty. Every time I checked, it was just a cold, damp space, cluttered with old junk left behind by previous owners. But the unease was growing, tightening like a noose around the house. Even Sarah, usually so logical and level-headed, started acting strange. She'd linger in front of the cellar door, her hand resting on the knob as if she were listening to something just beyond the wood. "I think there's something down there," she whispered to me one night, her face pale and drawn. "There's nothing down there," I insisted, though my voice shook. "It's just our nerves. We've been hearing things. Old houses creak." But I didn't believe it anymore. Something was wrong with the house. Something deeper than just old wood and stone. And I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was late one night, a week after we'd moved in, when the cellar door creaked open on its own. We were both in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. When we heard it, the unmistakable sound of the door swinging open. Sarah and I froze, staring at each other for a long, tense moment before I finally stood up and grabbed the flashlight from the mantel. "I'll check it out," I said, though my voice barely sounded like my own. I couldn't let her see how terrified I was. I made my way down the narrow hallway, the cold air growing thicker, almost suffocating, the closer I got to the cellar. The door was wide open, revealing the staircase that led down into the blackness below. My hand shook as I aimed the flashlight down the steps. "James!" Sarah's voice was tight with fear behind me. "I'm going to take a look," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. The air down there was colder than usual, and I could feel it pressing against my skin like ice. My breath came in shallow gasps as the beam of light swept across the stone floor. The same old boxes and shelves of forgotten junk. And then I saw it. At the far end of the cellar, hidden behind a stack of rotting crates, was a door that hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. It was small and old, its wood splintered and cracked, as though it had been sealed for centuries. Strange symbols, almost like runes, were carved into the frame, symbols I couldn't understand. My skin prickled with dread. "Sarah," I called, my voice barely a whisper. "There's something down here." She appeared at the top of the stairs, pale as a ghost. "What is it?" I didn't answer. I was too focused on the door, against every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. I reached out and grabbed the handle. It was ice cold to the touch. The door swung open with a slow, ominous creak, revealing a tunnel that led deep into the earth. The walls were rough stone, the air damp and musty, and I could barely make out the shape of the chamber that lay ahead. But there was something there, something moving in the shadows. "James, what are you doing?" Sarah's voice was panicked now, her footsteps coming down the stairs behind me. I stepped into the tunnel, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of my flashlight flickered, then dimmed, casting long, twisted shadows against the stone walls. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. And then I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the darkness. It stood at the far end of the chamber, its shape twisted and wrong, like it had been carved from shadow itself. It was hunched over, its arms too long, its face obscured in the blackness. But I could feel its gaze, cold and hungry, fixed on me. "James!" Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. "We need to go. Now!" The figure moved, stepping out of the shadows with a slow, deliberate grace, its body contorting unnaturally as it approached. Its face came into view, twisted and ancient, a mask of terror frozen in time. Its eyes, dark and endless, bored into mine, and I felt my blood turn to ice. We ran. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the cellar door behind us, but the house was no longer safe. The walls shook, the windows rattling violently, as if the very foundation was coming apart. The air filled with a low, guttural sound, like the groaning of something ancient awakening beneath the earth. We rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed locked, as though the house itself was holding us captive. The windows, too, were dark, no light penetrating the glass. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer. I could feel the thing from the cellar, its presence pressing down on us, suffocating, as it moved through the house. "James, please," Sarah cried, her voice cracking with terror. I grabbed a chair, hurling it at the window with all my strength. The glass shattered, and we scrambled through the jagged opening, running out into the cold night air. Behind us, the house groaned, the walls seeming to pulse as the darkness inside clawed at the edges of the windows. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally got the engine started. We sped away, the village disappearing into the night behind us. But as we rounded the last bend, I glanced back. The villagers were standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the gate. All of them, silent and still, their faces expressionless as they watched us leave. They didn't wave, didn't shout. They just stood there, waiting. And then, as the car sped further into the night, I heard it, a low whisper, soft and insidious, coming from the back seat. It wasn't over. Chapter 15, The Grandfather Clock, had always been a part of my life, a constant presence in the corner of my living room. It had been passed down through generations of my family, a towering, dark with heirloom that seemed to carry the weight of time itself. My father had cared for it, as had his father before him, and now it was my responsibility to keep it ticking. I spent my quiet evenings sitting in my worn armchair, tools spread out before me on the small side table, carefully adjusting the clock's inner workings. It had started to show its age in recent years, the chimes coming in slower, the pendulum not swinging quite as smoothly. I took great pride in fixing it, coaxing it back to life with every adjustment. There was something comforting about the steady, rhythmic ticking, a familiar heartbeat in the silence of my home. The house was empty now. Of course, my wife had passed several years ago, and our children had long since moved away. It was just me, the clock, and the memories. It was a quiet life, a routine one, until the clock began to change. It started subtly, as these things often do. One night, as I sat in my chair, polishing the clock's brass pendulum, I heard the chime, a deep, resonant toll that echoed through the house. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was, after all, a clock, and clocks were meant to chime. But then I realized something that made my hand freeze on the pendulum. It was only 8:15. The clock wasn't supposed to chime. It wasn't even wound. I stared at it for a long moment, my breath catching in my throat. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my pants as I moved closer to the clock. Its face, once comforting, now seemed darker, the glass reflecting the faint glow of the lamps in the room. I reached out, hesitated, then gently opened the glass door to check the weights inside. They weren't wound. The clock had no reason to chime, but as I stood there, the low hum of the pendulum suddenly stopped. The entire house fell into an eerie silence, the kind of silence that presses on your skin, heavy and unnatural. I closed the clock and stepped back, telling myself it was nothing, just an old mechanism acting up. But the feeling of unease stayed with me for the rest of the night, lingering like a shadow just out of sight. The next evening, it happened again. I was sitting in my chair, the soft light of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. The clock was still, silent as it had been for most of the day. I hadn't wound it, and I had no intention of doing so until morning. Yet, at exactly 9:30, the chime rang out, louder this time, more insistent. The sound reverberated through the house, rattling the windows. I stood, heart pounding, my eyes fixed on the clock. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize why it was happening. The cold dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach the night before was back, stronger now, creeping up my spine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a shadow, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, there and then gone. I turned quickly, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing, just the empty room, the dim light, and the clock. I shook my head, running a hand over my face. I was imagining things, surely. The mind played tricks, especially when one was alone. I returned to my chair, trying to focus on anything other than the oppressive silence that now filled the house. But the next night, when the clock chimed again, this time at 7:45, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a plate, when I heard the deep toll. The sound made my hands shake, the plate slipping from my fingers and shattering in the sink. I turned toward the living room, dread settling in my gut. As I walked through the hallway, I could feel the temperature drop, the air turning colder with each step. When I entered the room, the clock was still. The pendulum wasn't moving, but that shadow, that dark flicker, was back. It stood in the far corner of the room, just outside the reach of the lamp's light, shifting slightly like smoke. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The shadow wasn't a trick of the light. It was something real, something there. The clock chimed again, and this time, the shadow moved. It slid along the wall, closer to the clock, stretching across the room in a way that defied the logic of the dim lighting. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the shadow as it shifted, growing darker, more solid with each toll of the clock. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. For the rest of the night, I sat in my chair, unable to move, staring at the clock. Every few minutes, I thought I saw the shadow return, just a flicker at the edges of my vision, but when I turned, it was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The house, once so familiar and comforting, now felt alien, filled with something dark and malevolent. The clock chimed 3 more times that night, each time sending a fresh wave of cold dread through me. I didn't sleep. The next day, I resolved to stop the clock altogether. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew I had to stop it. The shadows, the coldness, the oppressive feeling that had taken over the house. It all had to be connected to the clock. It was the only thing that made sense. That night, as the sky darkened outside and the wind howled against the windows, I sat in front of the clock, tools in hand, ready to dismantle it if I had to. The house was too quiet, the air too still, as if it was holding its breath. The clock's hands crept toward midnight, and my heart raced with them. The closer it got to 12, the colder the room became. My breath fogged in the air as I crouched before the clock, my hands shaking as I reached for the weights. Just as the clock struck midnight, the chime rang out, louder than it ever had before. The sound reverberated through the house like a death knell, and with it, the shadows came to life. They poured from the corners of the room, swirling around me, dark figures with no faces, no features, just endless, suffocating blackness. They moved toward me slowly, deliberately, their presence pressing down on me like a physical weight. I tried to stand, to move away from the clock, but my legs wouldn't work. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the cold terror that gripped me. The clock chimed again, and the shadows crept closer, their forms twisting and shifting in the dim light. I reached out desperate and grabbed the clock's pendulum, trying to stop it, to make it all stop. But the moment I touched it, the shadows surged forward, their cold, formless hands reaching for me. I yanked my hand away, stumbling back as the shadows loomed closer. I could feel them, cold and suffocating, wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me toward the clock. The room spun, the shadows closing in from every direction. In a blind panic, I grabbed the hammer from my tool set and swung it at the clock's face, shattering the glass in a spray of shards. The chime stopped abruptly, the silence so sudden and jarring that it felt like I had gone deaf. The shadows retreated, slipping back into the corners of the room like smoke dispersing in the wind. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, staring at the broken clock. Its face was shattered, the pendulum still, the hands frozen at midnight. I waited, expecting the shadows to return, but the room remained silent, cold but silent. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that I finally dared to move. My legs were weak, my body trembling as I backed away from the clock. The house was still, the heavy weight of the night lifting slightly with the first rays of daylight. But as I turned to leave the room, something caught my eye. On the broken glass of the clock's face, faint but unmistakable, were handprints. Small, childlike handprints pressed against the inside of the glass as if someone or something had been trapped inside, trying to get out. The house was quiet again, but the cold dread remained. I knew it wasn't over. The clock may have stopped, but whatever had been in those shadows, whatever had reached out for me, was still here. And now, it was waiting. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the chills and thrills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content. Stay tuned for more nightmares.